The quiet was the first thing that got to me. Not a peaceful quiet, but a vast, sucking void of sound. My name is Alex, and for the last 4 months, I've been the sole resident of the Auditory Isolation Research Facility, a sprawling, brutalist complex buried deep in the Monongahela National Forest. They called it the E.I.C, the Extreme Isolation Chamber. My job, for a disturbingly large grant, was to endure the isolation, the sensory deprivation, and the endless silence, all to study the resilience of the human psyche under prolonged acoustic nullification. I was in Pod Delta, a room lined with 3 feet of anechoic foam, sitting on a floating floor. No external sound could get in. Even the vibrations of my own heart were muted, swallowed by the black wedges surrounding me. The company that ran this, the Aegis Group, a name as sterile as the walls, had 2 simple rules: stay in the pod for the full year and never touch the emergency beacon. Simple enough for a man running from his own life. I thought. The first month was hell. My mind tried to invent noises, phantom ringing, distant sirens, the sound of my own name whispered from the walls. I tracked it all in the journal they provided, a chunky, leather-bound thing that felt ancient. But by month 4, I had adapted. The silence became my normal. It was a blanket, a heavy, suffocating comfort. Then came the shift that IT happened on a Tuesday, day 117. I was sitting cross-legged, staring at the perfectly white door, my only connection to the outside world, when I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was an absence of an absence. A pressure release. Like a gigantic glass jar had been lifted, ever so slightly. Off my head, my ears popped, the way they do on a plane, but the sound of the pop was wrong. It was tinny, far away, and instantly absorbed. I panicked, checking the environmental controls. Oxygen levels, stable. Temperature, optimal. Acoustic integrity, 100%. The readouts were flawless that I chalked it up to psychological fatigue. The mind plays tricks. A week passed. The memory of the shift faded into the general haze of isolation, but the pressure was back. It felt like a subtle, low-frequency hum, the kind you feel in your sinuses rather than hear in your ears. I pressed my palms against the walls, checking for a stray ventilation leak, a structural flaw. Nothing. The foam was solid, cold, silent. Then, late one night, while lying on my cot, it finally registered as a sound. It was the faintest, most threadbare noise imaginable. A sound so low it was almost subsonic. It was a static buzz, like an AM radio dial that hadn't quite locked onto a frequency. But it wasn't coming from the walls, the floor, or the ceiling. That IT was coming from inside the silence that I sat up, heart pounding a rhythm I now found jarring. The facility's briefing had been crystal clear, absolute acoustic nullification. This was impossible. I grabbed my journal and a flashlight, the white beam jumping across the sound-dampening wedges. I held my breath, listening until my temples throbbed. The static was still there. A whisper, a shiver in the air. Bzzz. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it. I realized I could only hear it when I was perfectly still, my own internal noises, swallowing, blood rushing, momentarily quieted. It was the moment of complete stillness that allowed the sound to bleed through. I lay back down, terrified, and closed my eyes. I focused on the sound, trying to identify its source. It was mechanical, distant, yet somehow intimate. And then, as my mind stretched to interpret the buzz, it changed. The drone warped, rising in pitch just a fraction, and for a split, gut-wrenching second, the static seemed to coalesce. It sharpened into a syllable. A quick, guttural gasp. A single, wet inhale. Then, Just as quickly, it devolved back into the featureless, mind-numbing null static. But the moment was burned into my memory that I didn't sleep that night. I sat bolt upright, staring at the white door, listening to the impossible hum. The silence was broken, and what had replaced it wasn't just noise. It was a signal. I felt a sudden, cold certainty that I wasn't just enduring the experiment anymore, that I was being listened to. And whatever was on the other end of that terrifying, buzzing line, it had just taken a breath. The first 3 nights after the shift were a blur of nervous insomnia. I kept my hand inches from the journal, ready to record any change in the static. My routine, exercise, synthetic nutrient pack, staring at the white door, had been shattered. Now it was just listening. The Aegis Group had assured me that my only external communication would be the weekly well-being ping, a single green light on the door panel every Friday at noon. They received my biometric data and air quality reports automatically, but my journal was my only human connection. Now, I was desperate to find a way to communicate back through the silence that I started experimenting with sound. I tried to cough. Nothing. I clapped my hands. The anechoic foam worked perfectly. The clap died instantly, leaving no echo, only a flat, dead thwomp. I screamed. The sound barely traveled past my own lips. It was a suffocating, terrifying sensation, the sound of my own panic being murdered in midair, but the null static persisted. It was a constant, low-grade fever in the auditory space, always present when I achieved perfect stillness that on day 121, I found its pattern. It wasn't just a buzz. It was a loop that I realized this when I pressed my ear directly against the door panel, the thickest, most impenetrable part of the structure. The hum was fractionally louder here, and the subtle, rhythmic warping of the sound became clear to gasp. It wasn't a breath. It was a signal artifact, something digital twisting a constant drone. But my brain kept translating the sharp noise as a breath, a short, wet intake of air. And the loop wasn't short. I timed it with the watch on my wrist. Exactly 18.4 seconds. A perfect, cold loop repeating every 18.4 seconds. What was it? A distant piece of monitoring equipment? A flaw in the soundproofing? I recalled the initial briefing, where the lead scientist, a woman named Dr. Vivian, had used the phrase acoustic perfection. They had staked their reputation on this facility. A signal leak was unthinkable, unless it was intentional. If they were sending a signal, what were they trying to communicate? I began to treat the gasp as a beat, a unit of data, a message in code that I spent the next 2 days trying to influence the loop. I performed a small action, a light tap on the metal cot, and waited. I spoke a single word, hello, and waited. I even sang a short, 2-note melody. The loop remained rigid, unchanging. 18.4 seconds. Breathing, gasp. I sank into a profound despair. The signal was impervious to me. I was the subject, the object of observation, sealed away, and now something was watching me with a buzzing, cyclical, electronic E.I.C. was day 124 when I decided to test the most terrifying theory, that the sound wasn't coming from outside, but from within my environment. That I started with the journal. It was a heavy thing, bound in real leather, the only item in the pod not made of sterile metal or foam. I stared at the front cover, ran my fingers over the embossed Aegis Group logo, a stylized, 6-sided polygon. I ripped the first blank page out and placed it directly over the journal's spine. I lowered my ear. The static was slightly different. A tiny, almost undetectable change in frequency. It was either my mind playing tricks or the leather acting as a negligible amplifier. That I grabbed the heavy metal pen and began to carefully cut into the foam liner. I knew this was strictly against the rules, but fear had killed my compliance. The Aegis Group could cut my funding. The alternative was losing my sanity to a rhythmic sound of unknown origin. The anechoic foam was thick, a dark, oily gray. I cut a wedge about the size of my fist and pulled it out. Beneath it was a thin sheet of metal, the actual wall of the pod. I pressed my ear to the cool metal. The sound of the static was instantly, chillingly loud. Gasp. The gasp was no longer a signal artifact. It was something else. Closer, sharper, and for the first time, I felt the vibration on the drum of my ear. I held my breath, focusing on the newly exposed patch of metal. I was listening to the wall of my coffin, and the wall was vibrating with a life I couldn't explain. I leaned back, trembling, shining the light directly onto the metal sheet. It was featureless, smooth. Then I noticed it. Near the center of the circle I'd exposed, there was a minute hairline scratch, fainter than a whisper. I knelt closer, holding the flashlight steady. It wasn't a single scratch. It was a perfect, tiny, geometric symbol carved into the metal, and it matched the six-sided polygon logo on my journal. But there was one difference. Two of the inner lines had been subtly extended, crossing over each other, making the symbol look less like a sterile logo and more like a crudely drawn, asymmetrical human eye. And as I stared at the tiny, unsettling etching, the 18.4-second loop hit its climax. And then, instead of the quick, sharp gasp, the static suddenly broadened, flattened, and became something new, something impossibly ancient. A whisper, a single, unintelligible syllable vibrating through the metal. A sound that was simultaneously too low to be human and too deliberate to be random. And then the voice stopped. The static instantly looped back to the beginning, and I realized the gasp was just the sound of whatever this thing was reloading. The whispered syllable, vibrating against the raw metal of the pod wall, was the most significant event since I entered the E.I.C. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything I recognized, yet it felt heavy, final, like a tomb door grinding shut. It had taken me 3 days to find the source of the static, and now I had a loop. 18.4 seconds of buzzing drone, culminating in a wet gasp, or, as I now understood, a reload, followed by the chilling, whispered word that I scrambled back to the cot, adrenaline overriding the fear. I knew two things. One, the static was clearly a low-frequency broadcast intended for the wall itself, a feature I was never meant to discover. And two, by cutting the foam, I had essentially put my ear right up to the speaker. I immediately began to carve out more foam around the etched I symbol. I needed a bigger window, a better understanding of what I had violated. The cutting was agonizingly slow and silent, the penknife scraping against the stiff foam, leaving no trace of sound behind. When the hole was roughly the size of a dinner plate, revealing a smooth, circular patch of metal, I saw it. The etching wasn't just decorative. It was centered over a small, almost invisible seam in the metal, a panel boundary. I pressed my ear closer. The static was so loud now it felt like sandpaper on my eardrum. I waited for the 18.4-second climax. The drone peaked. Gasp. Then, the whisper came again. This time, clearer, louder, and with a horrifying sense of focus. It still wasn't a language I knew, but the texture of the sound, the way the air seemed to cling to the syllable, was distinctly unsettling. I tried to sound it out in my mind. Kaital. Or maybe Kihtao. As the static loop reset, I suddenly heard a new sound. It wasn't internal. It was real. A low, steady hum emanating from the electrical conduit on the ceiling. The power grid. It was too regular, too intentional to be a simple system failure. It sounded like an elevator motor, perpetually running. Then, the fluorescent lights above me, which had remained a constant, cold white since day one, began to subtly flicker. It wasn't a rapid strobe, but a gradual, deliberate dimming and brightening, synchronized with the rhythmic bzzz of the static. The pod was communicating with me not just through sound, but through light. The realization hit me. My action had triggered a response. By exposing the wall, I had revealed I was listening, and the facility, or whatever intelligence was operating the static loop, was acknowledging me. I backed away from the wall, heart hammering. I was no longer isolated. I was engaged. Just as the loop was nearing its third climax since the flickering started, the white door panel flashed. Not the weakly green light, but a sharp, blinding red. The alarm was silent, a visual indicator of a critical breach. I had broken the acoustic integrity. The Aegis Group knew that a second later. The ceiling conduit clunked once, a heavy, metallic sound that was almost immediately swallowed by the foam, and the low-level elevator-like hum stopped. The flickering lights became steady again. The red alarm on the door blinked out, and in the instantaneous, all-consuming return to the perfect, manufactured silence, there was no static, no 18.4-second loop, no bzzz-gasp-whispered, "IT was gone." I stood there, panting in the suddenly oppressive void, my ears ringing with the phantom memory of the sound. They had shut it down. They had cut the broadcast as soon as my breach was registered. I thought I was safe. I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong. I looked down at the freshly carved foam wedge on the floor. It was resting right next to my journal. As I reached for it, a small, dark shape slipped out from underneath the foam piece and into the light. It was a tiny, dried-up beetle. Dead, of course. No living thing could survive in the sealed environment of Pod Delta, but taped to its carapace, so small I almost missed it, was a minuscule sliver of paper, no larger than a grain of rice. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The paper was clearly old, yellowed parchment. Etched onto it in impossibly small, looping script was a single word. It was the syllable I had heard whispered through the wall. KTHEL. My panic intensified. The bug was inside the pod. The tiny note was taped to it, and the Aegis Group had just shut down the static from the outside. This note could not have come from them. I turned the dried insect over and over, desperately trying to understand how it had gotten in. The pod was a hermetically sealed chamber, but as I looked closely at the underside of the beetle, I saw something that made the blood freeze in my veins. The tiny legs weren't segmented like a normal insect's. They were slender, jointed filaments, and they were woven together in a complex, unnatural geometry. The beetle wasn't a bug. It was a minuscule, organic piece of wiring, a biological conduit. And as I held the thing, perfectly still, in the terrifying silence, I felt that familiar, subtle pressure in my ears. The silence wasn't perfect anymore. A faint, low-frequency hum was beginning again. A new static. And it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from the tiny, inert beetle in the palm of my hand. The static emanating from the dead insect in my hand was nothing like the mechanical drone from the wall. This was a fragile, high-pitched whine, like a micromotor straining. It felt brittle, a sound that could be shattered by a cough. The moment the realization hit me that the creature was some kind of organic listening device, I tossed it across the floor. It skittered silently across the metal plate and came to rest near the circular hole I had cut in the foam. The tiny, dried husk held the key to the impossible, a biological breach in a hermetically sealed world. And the note, the one word, KTHAL. My first, desperate instinct was to destroy it. I grabbed the metal pen, intending to crush the insect and its minuscule message. But as I raised my hand, the high-pitched whine from the beetle intensified, spiking in frequency until it scraped against my inner ear like a piece of glass that I froze. This new static felt directly tied to my intention. When I moved toward it, it shrieked. When I retreated, it softened, settling back into its fragile, persistent hum that I realized I couldn't crush it. I had to contain it, that I needed something airtight. My eyes scanned the sterile pod, the metal cot, the nutrient packs, the journal, and the small, translucent plastic bag where I was supposed to deposit waste. The waste bag was the only option. Moving with agonizing slowness, I retrieved the bag. It took 20 minutes to navigate the 3 feet between me and the beetle, the high-pitched whine ratcheting up and down with every centimeter I gained or lost. Finally, I trapped the creature and its cryptic parchment inside the bag, cinching the zipper tie tight. The sound instantly dropped in volume, muffled by the plastic, but it was still audible, a tiny, trapped shriek that I tied the bag around the base of my cot, keeping it close, yet contained. Now what? I had proof of a massive, inexplicable violation of the facility's security and a single, foreign word that I turned my attention back to the wall where I had made my breach. The small, exposed metal panel with the E.I.C symbol. The 18.4-second loop was still gone, silenced by the Aegis Group. But I was certain the source of the original static was still there, just dormant. That I sat down, pulling the heavy, leather journal onto my lap. Day 124. I uncapped the pen and looked at the date. Suddenly, the official log felt like a joke. This was no longer a research experiment. It was a containment unit that as I began to write down my findings, the internal whine from the waste bag began to change. It was no longer just a defensive shriek. It was modulating. It was forming patterns. I pressed my ear to the plastic bag. The beetle's high-frequency hum was shifting, rising and falling in complex waves. And my mind, starved for auditory complexity, instantly started trying to make sense of it. The sound wasn't a word this time. It was a feeling, a dense, rushing feeling, like the sound of water gurgling over pebbles, filtered through metal. Then, a sudden, sharp drop in frequency. The sound became heavy, slow, and deep. It was the sound of a massive, unhurried intake of AI. It was the original gasp, but amplified, translated into a high-pitched, internal language, and stretched out into a full second and a half. WHI. The rushing water. SSSHHHHO. The long inhale. WHHHHIE. The pattern repeated, but this time, the long inhale was followed by a brief burst of pure, high-frequency sound. A flash of noise so bright it hurt that I realized with sickening certainty that the creature in the bag wasn't transmitting. It was recording. It had recorded the moment the Aegis Group shut down the external static, and now it was playing back the residual sound. Encoded. I stared at the journal on my lap, the one item the researchers relied on for my sanity checks. It was the only place to record the physical evidence, the only place to write the word KTHEL and detail the creature. As I hesitated, the sound from the waste bag peaked again. The long inhale ended, and this time, the sudden burst of high-frequency static didn't feel like a flash. It felt like a deliberate erasure. I looked down at the journal, at the pristine, blank page. I hadn't written anything yet, but in the center of the page, where the leather spine met the paper, there was a small, fresh stain. It was a dark, oily gray, the exact color of the foam I had carved from the wall. And the stain was slowly, almost imperceptibly, expanding. It wasn't ink, or blood, or food. It was like the paper itself was dissolving, being ingested by the material that had sealed me in. And as the small stain touched the first line where I would have written day 124, I heard the final, bone-chilling layer of the new static, interwoven with the high-pitched whine, so low I could only hear it by reading the vibrations in my fingers, was the sound of a pen scratching on paper. A frantic, hurried sound. The Beetle wasn't just recording sound from the outside. It was recording a conversation I hadn't started yet, and it was showing me the consequence of writing it down. The sound of the scratching pen stopped abruptly. The gray stain on the paper stopped expanding, and the voice of the tiny device in the bag, its internal, encoded whisper, seemed to say only one thing: don't write. Talk. The silence was the most immediate weapon. When the Beetle's scratching sound stopped, the pod plunged back into an auditory vacuum, broken only by the thin, frantic whine from the plastic bag. The gray stain on the journal had paused, a quarter-sized patch of damp, sterile foam residue right where I would have logged my terrifying discovery that I understood the message. The journal is not safe. Recording the truth on paper was a direct path to erasure, not just of the text, but perhaps of me. The Aegis Group, or whatever was running this facility, was not just monitoring. It was censoring. My mind raced back to the only entity that had offered an alternative: the wired Beetle, the organic transmitter. Don't write. Talk. I looked at the sealed plastic bag tied to my cot. It was my only ally, and it was a tiny, desiccated, buzzing insect. I knelt beside it, feeling a surreal mix of desperation and utter terror. Thal, I whispered, testing the syllable. The whine inside the bag immediately spiked. Not a shriek of pain, but a rapid, electronic chatter, a surge of data transmission. It was listening. Who are you? I continued, keeping my voice low, afraid of the sound deadening foam. What does Thal mean? The response was immediate and terrifying. The whine in the bag didn't form a word. Instead, it formed a song. It was a simple, repetitive melody, 3 notes only, played on a high, buzzing frequency that felt painfully familiar. I struggled to place it, and then a shiver went down my spine. It was the melody I had hummed 3 days ago when I first tried to influence the external static. A short, 2-note phrase followed by a rising third. It had dismissed my attempt then. Now, it was playing it back to me. It had recorded every sound I made in the pod, even the ones the sound-deadening foam had supposedly killed. That I realized the E.I.C. wasn't designed for acoustic isolation. It was designed for acoustic containment. My voice wasn't escaping, but every sound I made was being captured by a hidden, systemic array of sensors far beyond the foam. And the Beetle was the only thing playing the recording back. Stop, I whispered, my voice thick. Stop playing that. The melody instantly ceased. The whine settled into a respectful, attentive hum. If you can hear me, I said, leaning in closer to the bag, you need to show me how you got in. Where's the breach? The hum in the bag began to modulate again, slowly, painstakingly, translating itself into a set of directional cues. The pitch would rise and hold, a sustained note. Then, a series of short, sharp clicks. The note was held when I turned my head towards the nutrient delivery port, a small, square hatch sealed with a rubber gasket on the floor near the door. The clicks came when I moved my hand toward it. The Beetle was telling me it came through the food delivery system. It was delivered. I crawled to the hatch, my hands shaking. I checked the seal. It looked intact. But as I ran my finger along the seam of the thick rubber gasket, I noticed a microscopic smear of something dark and viscous, like dried motor. Oil.it was the same dark, oily gray as the residue that stained the journal and the foam I had cut. I pressed my ear to the floor, right next to the port. The faint, distant mechanical beat. The original 18.4-second loop was back, fainter than before, almost subliminal, but definitely active. The Aegis Group had turned the broadcast back on, hoping I wouldn't notice its extreme low volume. But this time, the internal whine from the Beetle was louder than the external static. It was overriding the facility's signal.as. I listened to the port. The Beetle in the bag released a final, chilling sound. It wasn't a note or a song. It was a simulation of a familiar noise, a sound I hadn't heard in 5 months. Yet my brain instantly recognized its mechanical, rhythmic nature. It was the precise, high-pitched whir of the nutrient delivery port's locking mechanism. But played backward. It wasn't telling me how it came in. It was telling me how to open it. A wave of panic hit me. Opening that port would be the ultimate breach, a complete loss of airlock integrity. My isolation period would be terminated instantly. The red lights would flare, and the Aegis Group would be on me in minutes. But if I didn't, the gray stain on my journal would continue its slow, silent expansion, and I would be left alone with the bzzz gasp of the wall and the secrets of the tiny creature. I looked down at the port, then at my wrist. Day 124. The next official delivery was 3 days away. I pulled the steel cot away from the wall, retrieving the small, mirrored square of tempered glass that served as my sanitary check mirror during the initial phase. It was the only reflective surface in the room. I knelt by the delivery port and placed the glass flat on the floor next to the sealed hatch. I needed to see what was behind the rubber gasket without physically opening the seal.as. I did this. The Beetle's internal whine dropped to an almost silent whisper. Then, the whisper solidified, and I heard the clearest sound yet. A dry, rustling noise, like parchment being rolled. Then, a voice. Not a vibration, but a smooth, cold human voice, synthesized perfectly within the tiny creature. A voice that was neither male nor female. The seal is the sacrifice, Alex. Look closely. I carefully pressed the edge of the glass mirror against the seam of the rubber gasket and angled the flashlight. What I saw wasn't a clean, metal-on-rubber seal. The rubber had been meticulously, surgically carved away in tiny, symmetrical segments. The oily, gray residue wasn't motor oil. It was the biological sealant the Aegis Group had injected to repair the damage. And in the small, reflective sliver of the mirror, I saw what was slowly crawling out of the microscopic gap where the rubber used to be. It wasn't a beetle. It was a strand of the same oily gray fiber, thinner than hair, emerging from the darkness of the port. It was twitching, probing the empty air. And as I stared at the reflection, I saw the true, horrific nature of the fiber. It wasn't just a wire. The tip of the fiber was a perfect, six-sided microsyringe. It wasn't trying to escape the pod. It was trying to inject something into the room. I pulled the mirror away, my reflection staring back at me, my eyes wide with a sudden, all-consuming comprehension. The E.I.C. was not an isolation chamber. It was a pressurized fountainhead. The 18.4-second loop on the wall, the tiny beetle, the fiber, the gray residue. It was all the same thing. They were all pieces of a single, slow-acting organism. And the voice in the plastic bag, the synthesized sound of a perfect human whisper, delivered its final warning before the pod plunged into utter, final silence. I am not the listener, Alex. I am what they locked inside the silence. and you just gave me your eyes. The silence that followed the synthesized voice was the deepest yet, a crushing absence of sound that seemed to press against my skull. The high-pitched whine from the trapped Beetle had vanished completely. The external static, the faint 18.4-second gasp, was also gone. I was once again in acoustic nullification, but it was a terrifying quiet, like being alone with a loaded gun. My eyes were glued to the nutrient port, searching for the micro-syringe fiber I had seen in the mirror's reflection. It was gone. The gap in the gasket was sealed by the dark, viscous gray residue, the same stuff that had stained my journal. Then, I remembered the final line. And you just gave me your eyes. I backed away from the port, stumbling over my cot. I brought the small, mirrored glass up to my face, checking my eyes. They looked normal, frantic, bloodshot from the paranoia and lack of sleep. That I lowered the mirror and stared into the darkness of the pod's corner. The white walls were too clean, too perfect. I brought the mirror up again. This time, I didn't look at my pupils. I looked at the white surrounding my irises. It wasn't white. Running vertically through the sclera, the white part of my eye, were thin, incredibly faint black lines, like miniature vertical barcodes. They were almost invisible, perfectly straight, and they seemed to vibrate faintly, a visual counterpart to the sonic null static. My vision was clear, but every time I focused, the lines were there, anchored in the tissue of my eye. My body had been imprinted. The mirror was no longer a tool for checking my sanity. It was a display screen for the internal breach. I threw the mirror across the room. It hit the foam, made a flat, dull thud, and slid harmlessly away. I rubbed my eyes hard, desperate to wipe the lines away, but when I blinked, they were still there, like microscopic cracks in the world. Thal. The word flashed through my mind. Was it a name? A function? I looked down at the plastic bag containing the Beetle. I still had its attention, but the high-pitched whine was gone. What is Thal? I demanded, my voice weak. Tell me what you are. Silence. I repeated the question, louder. What is Thal? Is that your name? Suddenly, the air in the pod changed. It wasn't a sound, but a tactile sensation, a deep, heavy infrasound that resonated in my chest cavity, bypassing my ears entirely. It felt like being pressed against a subwoofer. The infrasound began to modulate, taking the place of the Beetle's voice. The translation was slow, heavy, and horrifyingly intimate. The voice came from my own bones. Thal, the feeling vibrated through my ribs. Is the correction. The vibration intensified. I stumbled back, clutching my chest. They built the isolation. The resonant hum continued to silence the signal. But the signal is necessary. The chamber is flawed. The silence it cannot hold. They built the isolation to silence the signal. My original hunch was wrong. Aegis Group wasn't broadcasting the static. They were trying to stop it. And the creature, Thal, was the signal. What are you correcting? I whispered, my voice sounding paper-thin against the deep resonance in my body. The vibration paused for a moment, an agonizing gap of silence. Then it returned, stronger. Your sight. As it spoke, the faint black vertical lines in my vision flared, stinging my eyes. The familiar white door of the pod, my mental anchor, began to ripple. The perfect, sterile white was shifting, and where the lines in my eyes intersected with the door's surface, the white dissolved into patches of dull, aged bone-gray. It wasn't just my eyes, it was the room. The sterile veneer was peeling back, revealing the true nature of the structure. The Aegis Group hadn't built a simple sound lab. They had covered something up. I saw where the metal sheets met the floor. The gaps were wider than they should be. choked with layers of dried, black residue. I saw the true texture of the door, not smooth metal, but pitted, uneven, and scarred. And worst of all, the seams of the anechoic foam, which had been invisible, were now highlighted by a thin, glowing, bioluminescent blue mold. The pod was not a clean environment. It was a decaying, sealed-off coffin, and standing right by the now bone-gray door, where I was certain there had been only flat metal before, was a shallow, rectangular indentation, perfectly sized to house a human body. It was not a feature of the pod design. It looked like something heavy had been repeatedly pressed into the metal over decades. They call this chamber delta. The infrasound hummed in my chest. But before, it was the vault. The infrasound stopped. I was left alone in the transformed room. The clean white of the pod had become a rotting gray. The lines in my eyes had settled, but now they were always active, constantly mapping the decay that I had been blind to the truth of my environment. Now I saw it all, and it was horrific that I looked at the rectangular indentation by the door, then down at the plastic bag containing the silent beetle. "What's in the vault?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. The beetle didn't use infrasound this time. A sharp, loud crack of pure, high-frequency sound, like a whip breaking the air, issued from the bag. And then a new, distinct sound emerged, a thin, dragging noise, originating not from the walls, but from underneath the metal floor plate I was standing on. It was a slow, uneven scrape, the sound of something large and heavy being pulled across rough concrete. And it was coming from the direction of the vault. The scraping sound from beneath the floor plate was not subtle. It was the heavy, uneven sound of something massive, dragging itself across concrete, and the vibrations translated through the floating floor of Pod Delta with frightening clarity. The sound was slow, agonizingly deliberate, and it was moving towards the rectangular indentation. The vault, by the door. My initial panic gave way to a cold, analytical dread. The tiny beetle, Thal, had only been a mic and speaker unit. The true entity was much larger, and it was beneath me. "What is that?" I whispered, looking at the plastic bag containing the silent, observing beetle. The beetle responded not with sound, but with an intense, localized heat emanating from the bag. It felt like holding a hot coal, forcing me to drop the plastic container immediately. The heat was a clear, nonverbal command. "Danger is imminent." I scrambled back towards the cot, desperate to put distance between myself and the floor. As I moved, the faint black vertical lines in my vision intensified, turning the bone-gray walls into a mesh of vibrating geometry. Thal was using my enhanced sight to communicate urgency that I watched the area near the vault indentation. The scraping sound intensified as the unseen mass arrived beneath that spot. The metallic floor plate over the indentation began to groan, a low, stressed shriek of metal under immense, localized pressure. Then, the scraping stopped. The pod was plunged into complete, suffocating silence once more. The infrasound, the heat, the vibrations, all gone. I held my breath, listening with every fiber of my being, the vertical lines in my eyes buzzing with residual energy. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing moved. "It stopped," I said, my voice hoarse. "What did it do?" The response came not from the beetle, nor the walls, but from the door panel itself. The metal surface of the perfect white door, the one I longed to open, suddenly warped. It didn't dent or crack. It simply changed texture, the flat surface rippling like water struck by an invisible stone. In the center of the ripple, the gray, viscous sealant, the stuff of Cthal's intrusion, began to weep from the microscopic seam of the door, forming a single, slow-moving drop. The drop fell onto the floor, silent in the acoustic null. But as soon as it made contact with the steel, the beetle in the plastic bag unleashed a high-frequency sonic burst, a single, complex chord of notes that instantly made my ears ache. It wasn't a warning. It was a recording of the sound of the drop hitting the floor, amplified and pitch-shifted, played for me to hear what the silence had stolen. The sound was flat, wet, and final. As I stared at the dark, expanding circle of gray sealant on the floor, the metal plate beneath it began to shimmer. The color bled away from the steel, and the metal became transparent, like glass. The forced correction of my sight was complete. I was looking through the floor. What I saw beneath the spot where the drop fell was a subterranean chamber. It was vast, damp, and lined with smooth, black concrete. And there, pressed against the underside of the steel floor right beneath the vault, was the source of the scraping. It was not a machine. It was a tangle of thick, sinuous black cables, each one the width of a human arm. They weren't electrical or fiber optic. They looked organic, covered in a slick, chitinous material. They were not moving now. They were anchored to the concrete floor by massive, irregular deposits of that same dark, viscous gray sealant. The cables formed a dense, roiling coil, but one segment was clearly visible, a thick, black tendon that vanished horizontally into the concrete wall of the facility. The Aegis Group didn't just build a pod to contain sound. They built a foundation to anchor something. And the object of my immediate, suffocating dread was what lay at the center of the coil. The hub of the black cables. Where they all converged was a single, immense object, a smooth, gray-white sphere, nearly filling the space beneath the vault. It was impossibly huge, cold, and entirely featureless, except for one detail. Etched across the sphere's smooth surface, repeating infinitely like veins, was the geometric symbol of the asymmetrical human eye. This was the source of the signal. This was the true, vast Cthal, and the object was cracked. A single, jagged fissure ran from the top to the bottom of the sphere, leaking the gray-white sealant that was slowly hardening into the anchor points. As I watched, horrified, the transparent patch of floor began to cloud over, the color and opacity of the steel rushing back to conceal the horror below. But before the view was completely obscured, the massive gray sphere at the center of the cables gave one final message, transmitted directly to the implanted static in my eyes. The sphere didn't move, but from its massive crack, the viscous sealant momentarily flowed into the shape of a single, perfect, minuscule human hand, and then it reached out, not toward the steel floor, but toward the faint, buried metal coffin built directly into the concrete wall of the vault below. The floor became solid steel again. The silence returned. I was left staring at the opaque metal floor, knowing exactly what was beneath me. The image of the colossal, cracked sphere, the core of Cthal, and the tiny, reaching hand of sealant hovering over a metal coffin below the vault. It was a vision of pure, organized horror. I had gone from absolute isolation to being trapped on the lid of a nightmare. The transparent viewing window had vanished, the steel floor cold and opaque beneath my feet. Only the constant, faint vertical lines in my vision remained, a perpetual, silent radar tracking the real geometry of the pod, the decay, the scars, and the bone-gray truth beneath the white paint. That I knelt on the floor, my eyes fixed on the vault indentation. My only immediate threat, the tiny beetle, was silent in its plastic bag, its purpose seemingly complete. It had shown me the truth that I knew, that Cthal was not trying to escape. It was trying to communicate. It was the correction. It was showing me what Aegis Group had suppressed. That I picked up the journal, flipping past the gray, oily stain on day 124. I was no longer afraid of the journal. The Beetle had warned me not to write the truth, but it hadn't stopped me from trying to decipher it. I needed to understand the single, key piece of information Cthal had revealed. The syllable that I wrote the word on a fresh page, carefully copying the tiny, looping script from the parchment found on the Beetle, etched. My brain, starved of complexity, churned over the word. Phonetics, anagrams, everything. I started linking the word to the images. KTHEL equals the correction, KTHEL equals the sphere / signal, KTHEL equals the hand reaching for the coffin. I closed my eyes and let the internal static in my vision vibrate. I pressed my hands to the journal, and that's when the Beetle responded. A low, guttural gurgle came from the plastic bag. It was the sound of air moving through water, thick and desperate. The Beetle was silent, but the air around it seemed to generate the sound. The gurgle began to repeat, forming a word in a tongue I suddenly felt I had spoken in a past life. KTHL. I wrote it down phonetically. KTHAL. Then, the gurgle shifted, the stress moving. KTHAL. And finally, the gurgle sped up, creating a rapid, almost breathless sound. KTEL. My hands froze. KATEL. It sounded like a common English word, if you remove the accent and the guttural stop. Cattle. That I scribbled the word cattle next to KTHAL, that it made a terrible, sickening sense. If this was a vault, a containment unit, and the researchers were Aegis, a shield, then the thing they were isolating was a signal, and I was the cattle. The subject. The test. That I looked at the nutrient port, the delivery mechanism through which I received all my food and water. I hadn't eaten the synthetic packs in 3 days, my body running on pure, terrified adrenaline. The correction is showing me the reality of the test. Suddenly, the infrasound returned, a bone-deep tremor that spoke with cold, synthesized clarity, replacing the gurgle. It was the smooth, cold voice from the plastic bag. The vault, the voice resonated in my chest, was not sealed to contain the sound. It was sealed to contain the subject, the one beneath you. I pointed at the vault indentation. The coffin? What's in the coffin? The voice shifted, a subtle, almost melancholy pitch added to the resonance. An original listener. An original listener. The first. They failed to correct her sight. She resisted the silence. They encased her. The 18.4-second loop was not a broadcast. It was her heartbeat, suppressed and looped. My own heart skipped a beat, the sound instantly absorbed by the foam. The constant, mechanical drone I heard for weeks wasn't a signal at all. It was the rhythm of a person being killed, endlessly repeated. And you, the voice of Cthal hummed, are the replacement, the new subject, the new cattle. The infrasound paused. The floor beneath the vault indentation began to warm, the steel growing noticeably hotter. The 18.4-second loop is now off. They think they won, but you saw the hand. The hand of the original listener is now free from the coffin. It is reaching for your key. I looked at the small emergency beacon strapped to my wrist, a bulky metal band with a single, glowing blue button. The button that would instantly end the isolation and summon the recovery team. The one rule was, never touch the beacon. The beacon will open the door, I said, realizing. No, the voice corrected me, the infrasound spiking with a horrible, sharp finality. The beacon is not a key. It is the trigger for final sealing. It terminates the experiment. It ensures the signal is contained. Then why tell me about it? The heat radiating from the floor intensified, making me recoil. The air in the pod grew thick, humid, because the original listener needs to exchange places. She needs the silence to hold for one more moment. And your eyes are the only thing she trusts. The voice faded, replaced by the sound of the floor plate directly over the vault heating to an unbearable temperature. The metallic groaning started again, not from pressure, but from thermal expansion. The gray sealant around the door, the oily residue, was starting to boil. And then I heard the single, unmistakable sound of the emergency beacon on my wrist. A metallic, quiet click that I hadn't touched it. I looked down. The blue light was still steady, but the mechanism had been engaged. The original listener had found her way out, and she was initiating the final seal. I had seconds before the door locked permanently. The metallic click from the emergency beacon on my wrist was quiet, swallowed by the foam, but in the oppressive silence, it sounded like a thunderclap. I hadn't pressed the button. The original listener, Thal's first subject, had somehow remotely engaged the final protocol. The countdown to lockdown, to my permanent sealing, had begun. The floor beneath the vault was now searing hot, and the boiling gray sealant around the door was emitting a faint, chemical steam. The pod was becoming a pressure cooker. "No," I shouted, the sound instantly dead. "You're trapping me." The infrasound returned with a sharp, heavy thud, like a body falling onto thick carpeting. The voice was synthesized, cold, and final. "The seal is for the signal. You are the only aperture left, Alex." Aperture. A window. A way out. I scrambled across the hot floor, ignoring the stinging heat. The only way out of the immediate, permanent lockdown was to breach the seal before the final door mechanism engaged. The nutrient port. Thal had shown me how to unlock it. The recorded sound of the mechanism running backward. I reached the port on the floor near the door. The tiny, high-frequency whine of the Beetle in the plastic bag started up again, but this time, it was a sound of panicked encouragement, not cryptic data that I had to manually replicate the sequence that the Beetle had recorded. But I had no tools. Only the flimsy metal pin I had used to cut the foam. I thrust the pin into the narrow gap between the port hatch and the rubber gasket. It immediately became slick with the gray sealant residue. I applied pressure, trying to wedge the pin beneath the hatch. A new, frantic sound emerged from the plastic bag. A sharp, scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across concrete. It was an auditory warning. I looked up at the main white door. A series of microlights, previously invisible, began to flash rapidly around the perimeter of the frame. They were counting down the seconds to final seal. No sound, just blinding, rhythmic flashes. 0.5 seconds. I jammed the pin harder into the seam. The metal tip bent, folding against the pressure. 0.4 seconds. The heat from the vault was overwhelming, radiating out and making the air difficult to breathe. I focused on the lines in my eyes, Thal's sight, and forced myself to see the intricate mechanism of the nutrient port beneath the metal. The sight correction showed me the locking gears, how they needed to retract. 0.3 seconds. I used the bent tip of the pen as a small, sharp hook and yanked the pen outward, tearing away a chunk of the rubber gasket. The hiss of depressurization was instant and deafening, slicing through the perfect silence like a knife. A rush of stale, real air from the outside world hit my face. Air thick with the scent of damp concrete and ozone. 0.2 seconds. The gray sealant around the door, sensing the breach, flowed back into the nutrient port opening, trying to seal it instantly. I fought against the viscous material, pulling the hatch with everything I had. 0.1 second. Just as the microlights on the door went solid red, signaling final lockdown, the nutrient hatch snapped open with a violent clang. The main door, moments later, issued a dull, mechanical thud as the final, massive steel bolts slammed home. I was locked in, but I had a tiny, open gateway to the facility's interior air shaft that I looked into the small, square opening of the port. It was too small for me to squeeze through, but the rush of air was a torrent. Then, the final, chilling sound from the blackness of the port opening, a faint, rhythmic ticking began. Not a clock, but a drip, 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 drip. I pressed my eye to the opening. The gray sealant that had clogged the port wasn't just residue. It was a slick, wet membrane, and it was quickly being pulled away from the opening by the rushing air. And as the membrane retracted, the source of the dripping became visible, hanging just inside the narrow air duct, suspended by a length of the black, chitinous cable that made up the body of the subterranean Cthal, was a tiny, desiccated, perfectly preserved human-fingered. It was pale, unnaturally long, and the nail was brittle. And from its tip, the gray sealant was slowly dripping onto the metal edge of the port. This was the hand of the original listener. And it was a physical piece of her. The finger was still, but the black cable holding it was slowly, deliberately twining itself around a single, minuscule object hanging next to it. The Beetle-sized organic transmitter that Cthal had used to communicate with me. The Beetle was being retrieved. The information transfer was complete. Then, from the darkness of the open port, a final sound. Not a synthesized voice, but a raw, dry sigh of relief, followed by a barely audible, almost feminine giggle. The original listener was free. She had escaped into the ventilation system, and as the cable rapidly retracted the finger and the Beetle, carrying them into the darkness, I looked around the sealed pod. The heat from the vault was fading. The flickering red lights on the main door went dark. The only sound was the rush of stale air through the nutrient port. The pod was locked down, and the true signal was out that I was left alone in the perfect, deep silence. And I was the only listener left. The pod was now an official vault. The silence was absolute, heavier than ever, now that I knew its true purpose was to contain the horrific consciousness of the original listener. The emergency beacon, still locked on my wrist, was a dead weight, a silent threat of permanent entombment, an my only connection to the outside. And my only vulnerability was the wide-open, square mouth of the nutrient port on the floor. It was spewing a steady stream of stale air into the pod, air thick with the smell of mold and wet decay. I sealed the plastic bag containing the silent, useless penknife and placed it next to the port that I was locked in, but the outside world was now inside the pod. And the entity, the liberated signal, Cthal's correction, was out there. I crawled closer to the port and pressed my ear to the opening. The rushing air created a continuous white noise, a sound the foam couldn't fully absorb. As it was now flowing from the containment system, I closed my eyes, forcing the residual energy of Cthal's sight into focus. The black vertical lines, the constant retinal static, were vibrating wildly, interpreting the chaos of the outside world that I didn't hear the sound. I felt the data encoded in the turbulent air. The rush of air wasn't random. It was a complex, low-frequency pressure wave, and my augmented vision was translating the wave's geometry. I grabbed the journal and flipped to a new page, drawing a shaky diagram of the pressure waves I was sensing. They were sharp peaks and flat troughs, a graph of the airflow itself. And as I mapped them, the pattern became clear. It was Morse code. The original listener, now free in the facility's ventilation system, was using the air ducts as a gigantic pipe organ, transmitting a message to me through the manipulation of air pressure. I began to frantically decode the pulses. Pulse, 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 flat, spulse, flat, pulse, repulse, pulse, flat, I pulse, 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 H. I stopped, my hand trembling over the paper. The word was forming too quickly. Srh. No, that didn't make sense. That I wiped my brow and took a deep breath, focusing the retinal static. I was locked in a perfect silence, decoding a sound I couldn't hear, being sent by a consciousness I couldn't see. That I tried decoding it backward. The airflow was constantly rushing, meaning the signal was inverted. The pulses I was tracking were actually the moments of least resistance, where the signal was holding the air. That I reversed the entire message, the true word. HIRSE. I stared at the letters. Hirese? Nonsense. The infrasound returned, a localized thump directly beneath the nutrient port, originating from the main duct. The synthesized voice of Kthal hummed. You invert the signal, Alex. But you do not invert the language. My mind raced. The message was already inverted by the air system. I was in America, but this facility was hidden, operating outside the normal world. That I inverted the word. Hers becomes Esri. Still nonsense. That I went back to the original, inverted Morse code, SRH. I mentally flipped the word, not letter by letter, but the entire sequence. HIRS. H. I. R. S. Point. My eyes snapped wide. Here's. It wasn't English. It was a common, ancient acronym used in biological and military labs for host isolation and retrieval system. That IT was telling me the name of the project. Then, the final, crucial letter burst through the port in a rapid sequence of pressure waves, making the air in the pod briefly feel metallic and cold. HIRST. The acronym was H-I-R-S-T. The full name, Host Isolation and Retrieval System, Temporal. This wasn't just containment. It was about time. The voice of the signal, vibrating in the floor, gave its chilling confirmation. They are coming, Alex. Not from outside, but from behind. Suddenly, the continuous rushing air from the port stopped. The valve was slowly, silently closing. The original listener was cutting off my line of communication. I screamed, pressing my face to the closing slot. Who was coming? The Aegis Group. The air was almost completely sealed. In the last millisecond, a final, impossibly faint sound emerged. It was not a gurgle or ahum. It was the clear, thin sound of a child's music box winding down. The delicate tune played 3 notes, the same 2-note melody followed by a rising third, the melody I had hummed days ago. But this time, the melody was not mocking. It was a farewell, and as the tune faded, a tiny, almost subliminal click came from the inside of the port mechanism, a different sound than the lock. It was the sound of a micro camera activating. The original listener wasn't just leaving. She was using the last functional aperture to take a picture. A picture of me, standing in the silenced vault. Then the port sealed with a soft, final whoosh. Absolute, deadly silence. I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the message. Hearst. They were coming, not from the facility entrance, but from behind. From the temporal aspect of the research, I realized with certainty what the 18.4-second heartbeat loop was. It wasn't just a record of the original listener's death. It was a temporal anchor, a continuous, low-level energy drain designed to keep the first subject in a state of perpetually prolonged, contained existence, and I had broken the anchor. The original listener was free and out of sync. I looked down at my journal, where I had scribbled the letters, HIRST. Suddenly, a massive, grinding boom reverberated through the anechoic foam, not from the door, but from the ceiling. The foam had failed. The walls had failed. Something big had hit the pod. the ceiling light flickered violently, not with Kthal's gentle rhythm, but in an explosive, strobe-like burst, and when the light returned to a steady, buzzing white, a new feature was visible on the ceiling, a massive, circular scorch mark the size of a manhole cover. It was perfectly black, perfectly round, and at the center of the scorch mark, where the pod's thermal-resistant hull had failed, was a thin, swirling vortex of pure, pitch-black liquid beginning to drip onto the floor. It was moving too slowly for gravity, defying viscosity. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from above, and they were bringing their own temporal element with them. The thunderous boom from the ceiling was the sound of a containment field collapsing, an audible violation of the E.I.C's core principle. The scorch mark, a perfect black circle above me, was the entrance for the temporal aspect of the Hearst project. The black liquid dripping from the center of the scorch wasn't water or oil. It was an unnaturally thick, pitch-black liquid darkness that curled and resisted gravity, clinging to the air before falling. It hit the white floor with no sound, but where it touched, the metal instantly blackened and pitted, the corrosion happening in an accelerated, sickening second. They are coming from behind. The final words of Kthal's message echoed in my mind that I stared up at the growing stain on the ceiling, the vertical lines in my vision vibrating so rapidly that the room felt unstable. My foresight was interpreting the liquid as pure, raw temporal instability, a piece of another timeline bleeding into mine that I backed away toward the main door, the only solid, uncompromised wall left. The scorching heat from the vault beneath the floor had subsided, as if the energy had been redirected upward as the first drop of the black liquid landed near my foot. The pod plunged back into the heavy, deep silence. But this time, the silence was laced with a new kind of sound, a reverse echo that I heard, a faint, high-pitched thud, the sound of the floor plate closing, followed by the sound of my own voice, muffled and panicked, saying the seal is the sacrifice. The sound was not coming from the past. It was being pulled out of my present and played backward, instantly decaying into nothingness. The liquid was a void, not just of space, but of time. I looked down at my wrist, at the emergency beacon. The blue light was still steady, but the mechanism had been engaged. The countdown had been completed hours ago when the original listener triggered it. I was in a state of final, irreversible lockdown. As the black liquid gathered and dropped faster, I heard another reverse echo. The sound of the metallic click from the beacon, played in reverse, followed by the sound of my pen scraping against the foam, uncutting the hole I had made. The Hearst project wasn't about holding an entity. It was about creating a time loop and trapping the subject in it. I rushed to the journal, desperate to understand the original listener's fate. I flipped to the page where I had written. The 18.4-second loop was her heartbeat, suppressed and looped. The black liquid was now dripping steadily, pooling on the floor. I watched, horrified, as the liquid began to spread outward, consuming the white paint and sterilizing the room with its temporal decay. Then, from the spreading puddle, a faint, rhythmic sound began to emerge. It was not a gurgle or a hum. It was a precise, clear ticking, tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of a countdown, but the countdown wasn't moving forward. The ticking was getting slower, more elongated, as if the sound waves themselves were being stretched. I realized what the original listener had done. By breaking the anchor, she hadn't just escaped. She had sent a piece of herself back in time, the Beetle and the information, and left me to be the new anchor. The temporal liquid was the original listener's containment field, slowly moving forward to engulf me, to reset the entire experiment, with me as the new subject in the 18.4-second heartbeat loop that I was about to become the new vault's permanent resident, that I had one option. Thal had shown me that the true vulnerability wasn't the door, but the original listener's coffin beneath the floor, where the previous anchor was buried. That I ran to the vault indentation. The area was cool now, having expended its heat in the final lockdown. I grabbed the metal pen, the only tool I had, and jammed the bent tip into the hairline seam of the floor plate above the coffin. The ticking from the temporal liquid was now painfully slow. Tyanic. I pulled the pen back, and a small, rusted piece of metal chipped off the seam. Then, the final reverse. Echo. The pod filled with the muffled, reversed sound of a violent scream, a sound that was being sucked backward into the past. It was a sound I hadn't made yet. That I looked at the temporal liquid. The pool was now 3 feet wide. As the reverse scream faded, the sound of the ticking completely stopped. The liquid gave one final, violent lurch, and a shape began to rise from the surface. It was a perfect, 6-sided micro-syringe, just like the one I had seen in the mirror, but magnified 10 times, composed entirely of the swirling black liquid. It was suspended in the air, aimed directly at my chest, and from the center of the syringe, a tiny, almost subliminal voice echoed, not from Kthal, but from the liquid itself, the voice of the Aegis Group's lead researcher, Dr. Vivian. The temporal anchor is unstable. Engage host retrieval. Subject designated Alex is now the new energy source. Begin the 18.4-second loop. The black liquid syringe lunged forward. I closed my eyes, and just before the impact, I heard the sound I knew was coming. My own, final, suppressed gasp, instantly swallowed by the overwhelming silence. The impact of the black, liquid syringe was silent, a cold, total absence of sensation that bypassed pain entirely. The substance wasn't material. It was an intrusive void. It flowed into my chest, and the world fractured. The 18.4-second loop didn't begin with a bzzz. It began with a sudden, overwhelming flashback. A torrent of sensory data that wasn't mine. That I saw a woman's face. Pale, terrified, her hair matted with sweat, her eyes staring straight into mine. It was the original listener. Then, a quick succession of images, a lab coat with the Aegis Group logo, a rough metal surface, and finally, a claustrophobic vision of the inside of a coffin. My consciousness was being flooded with her final, suppressed moments, merging her end with my beginning. The 18.4-second count started. The silence was absolute, but my internal world was a cacophony of fear and borrowed trauma. As the temporal liquid finished its injection, I felt a massive, energetic reversal. My body went rigid. The silence was ripped open by a terrifying noise, the sound of my own heart beating, a frantic, booming rhythm that resonated not through air, but through my bones. It was the true, raw, unsuppressed sound of a human life in crisis. And then, the sound began to slow. The powerful rhythm was being deliberately dampened by the facility, absorbed by the temporal anchor now forming in my chest. 15 seconds left in the loop. I opened my eyes. The black liquid had completely vanished. The ceiling was clean, the scorch mark gone. The floor was pristine white. The nutrient port was sealed. The pod was perfect. The retinal static in my eyes was gone. The bone-gray decay, the blue mold, the scars on the door, all of it had been wiped clean by the temporal reset. I was in the sterile pod delta I had known on day one. The metallic pen, however, was no longer in my hand. I looked down. It was gone. I looked at the plastic waste bag tied to the cot. It was empty, sealed, and pristine. The beetle was gone. I looked at the journal. It was closed. I opened it. The page for day 124 was blank. The gray stain was gone. The earlier entries were clean, recording only boring, compliant observations that I was exactly where I started. The experiment had been reset. 10 seconds left in the loop. I touched my wrist. The emergency beacon was still there, but the blue light was steady, inactive. Then, from the walls, the original sound returned. The low, persistent, mechanical buzz of the static drone. A barely audible hum that felt like a low-grade fever. 5 seconds left in the loop. The bzzz intensified, climbing in frequency. I fought it. I tried to scream, to move, to break the sterile illusion, but the temporal anchor in my chest held me, damping my efforts. 2 seconds left in the loop. The bzzz peaked. And then I heard it. A single, sharp, wet sound, instantly consumed by the silence. The original gasp, the loop completed. Then the static returned, starting the cycle again. I was now the anchor. My suppressed, agonizing heartbeat was the 18.4-second drone, and the sharp, wet gasp was the sound of the Aegis Group's system extracting the necessary energy for the temporal field to remain stable. I was the new original listener. I stood there, trembling, trapped in the infinite loop of containment. And then I noticed the final, chilling detail. The journal was open on the page I had last seen. The page for day 1. My first entry. I hadn't noticed it before, but the script was unfamiliar, tight, and feminine. I read the first line of the journal, the opening thought of the previous subject. The quiet was the first thing that got to me. Not a peaceful quiet, but a vast, sucking void of sound. My name is Alex. It wasn't my handwriting, but it was my name. The original listener had escaped the anchor and replaced herself with me, pushing her identity, the name Alex, into the timeline. She had taken my future, but as I stared at the page, listening to the agonizing, rhythmic bzzz of my own suppressed heart, I noticed a tiny, almost invisible stain on the leather binding, right next to. The embossed Aegis Group logo. It was a minute, dried-up piece of dark, oily gray material, and as I pressed my finger to it, I felt a tiny, minuscule vibration. A faint, fragile, high-pitched whine. The correction had worked. The true signal was gone, but a piece of the information, the tiny, wired Beetle, thal, had been successfully embedded into the physical structure of the pod's future. That I was the new subject, trapped in the loop. But I was not entirely alone. The static continued its agonizing drone, and I knew that in the infinite silence of the vault, a new, tiny, buzzing consciousness was waiting for its next subject to arrive, waiting for the silence to be broken, waiting for the next exchange. The cycle was sealed.